Hello and welcome to the Must Talk podcast. This is Conor O'Boyle. Today I'll be speaking with American music supervisor, record producer and music educator Andy Hill. Andy has served as Vice President of Music Production for Disney during the Renaissance period and oversaw a number of acclaimed films such as The Lion King, Beauty and the Beast, The Little Mermaid and Aladdin. Since then, he's gone on to set up his own production company and he's worked on other pictures such as Anastasia, Evolution and James and the Giant Peach. Andy has recently brought out a new book called Scoring the Screen, which I highly recommend, and we get into in some depth. So without further preamble, I give you Andy Hill. I'm here with Andy Hill, and he is doing a 2-week masterclass with us here at Pulse College, and I've stolen him away for half an hour to chat some shop. So, Andy, can you give us a little introduction and tell us how you got started in the industry?
Sure. I mentioned that Danny Elfman has said in interviews that he had this kind of epiphany sitting in a darkened movie theater listening to the score for The Day the Earth Stood Still, and that was the moment when he decided, this is what I want to do. There was no similar moment of just, blinding light or satori for me. But I think that if there's a genesis to my passion for film music, it probably is Elmer Bernstein. Okay. Now, as a kid, like almost every kid, I had a craving for action films, and I had my heroes. And among my heroes in those days were people like Steve McQueen.
Right, okay.
There was a film called The Great Escape that Elmer Bernstein scored, I think 1962, something like that. And just about the same time, he also scored To Kill a Mockingbird, which was the adaptation of a successful novel. Had a big impact in the States and elsewhere on the civil rights movement and the issue for voting rights for black folks and so forth. The scores couldn't have been more different, but they were clearly by the same person. There were certain there was something about the voice that I found incredibly powerful and attractive, and I was a very, very small kid at that point, but I remember wanting to understand what it was that made that music so moving for me. Okay. Part of it turned out to be his use of rhythm. Part of it turned out to be his use of non-traditional modes. Mm-hmm. To Kill a Mockingbird is a score that is its color is largely based on the Lydian mode, right, okay, which has now become, as a result of that score's success, it's become kind of a convention, almost a cliche for composers to use Lydian when they want to evoke this kind of nostalgic, okay, pastoral sense. But at any rate, there was a lot going on in the scores that intrigued me that I did not understand at all because, I was not a little Mozart. I wasn't raised from 3, to understand music in a formal sense. There was music in the house. My dad was a soprano sax player, kind of a middling jazz player, never great, big ambitions, probably not enough not enough native talent.
This is in Chicago?
This is largely in Chicago.
In Chicago, yeah. Right, okay. Yeah. So there would have been a fairly, lively scene there at
Absolutely.
that time. Obviously Chicago's still fairly central and important in terms of its output, but,
it was
even more so then.
It was a big town for jazz, a big town for the blues, and he was a practicing lawyer, but he would go out at night and stay out to the wee hours, working with his mates. Now, there was a lot of music in the house, always a lot of music on the phonograph, and some of these influences would be common, to other composers as well. Prokofiev, very popular with both my mom and dad. Right, okay. Peter and the Wolf, of course, for me.
Yeah.
Romeo and Juliet,
Of course.
for them. The Lieutenant Kiji suite was one I remember from early on. Again, kind of just, whet my appetite to understand what made this stuff work. And then, honestly, from childhood through, young adulthood, I didn't do much to cultivate any sort of rigor or any sort of real, discipline when it came to music. Played clarinet for a while, with the school orchestra. Hated it. Convinced my mother to buy me a guitar. Loved that. Became the lead singer in a band, and remained lead vocalist for a series of bands all the way through to about the age of 30. And it really wasn't until now. I never lost the fascination for film music or for film. I've always been a cinema nut, and the movies have always been a staple part of my diet. But it really wasn't until the sort of rock and roll dreams had finally kind of played themselves out. Right. And by the way, that whole thing, that's kind of generational. I mean, growing up when I grew up mostly in the 70s, that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to be rock stars. Yeah. Quit college, formed a band, toured around for a while. That didn't click. Went back to college, started another band, toured around for a while. That didn't click. Moved to a goat farm in Western Maryland with another band during the disco era, of all things.
And did the music that your bands played, was it consistent, or did it change?
It was
per band.
in the beginning, of course. It's all cover stuff. That's
right.
how almost everybody starts. But once I, my songwriting abilities matured a little bit, I think, for a while I tried to walk the same path that people like Van Morrison and Bruce Springsteen, particularly Bruce in the earlier records, had, which is kind of a white soul, blue-eyed soul sort of thing. That never felt really natural. In fact, my writing for the bands never felt entirely my own until we got to what was known as the New Wave era, which is basically 1978 to 82, and that's Blondie, that's the Cars, that's the very beginning of the whole 80s, the kind of renaissance of the kind of really well crafted but frivolous pop music that had been popular in the 60s, and I loved that.
Yeah, it's kind of making a return now. You've got that sort of synth pop.
Right.
It's really heavy, kind of melody driven.
Yeah,
pop's kind of coming back now. I don't know if you've heard. There's an English band called the 1975. Have you heard those guys?
Yes, I have.
It's very, very nostalgic for that sort of.
Because I don't think it ever goes away.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that you can go back and you can find pop tunes from the 40s that have that same sort of. It's an infectiousness, a bounciness, a swing, and a cleverness with wordplay and lyrics that that always seems to work. And you can find in the 50s, in the doo-wop era, there's an equivalent of that. In the early, even the pre-Beatles 60s with Phil Spector and producers like that. And then, of course, the Beatles just kicked it up a few more notches, and really pop music, other than rhythm and blues, has essentially been defined by Brits ever since then. But I loved that stuff, and I was very much at home. However, when we had my last band had a kind of commitments like ending, in that it was success that killed us.
Right.
We finally got the big manager and the offer of a record deal, and that broke up the band because we
Okay.
simply couldn't agree on anything. By that point, we all hated each other.
I think that's the story of a generation of musicians, that what they seek ultimately destroys them, isn't
Right,
it? It's the
right.
classic, almost like tragedy. It's like a Shakespearean tragedy, isn't it? The whole story leads up to this moment, and then that moment is the moment that destroys the
It's a great
the character.
irony. It's sometimes it comes down to not being quite ready for what
Yeah.
you want, for what you thought you wanted. Fear of success.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's that the pressures of getting that close
Mm-hmm.
to the gold ring cause dissension and conflict.
Yeah.
There's always a certain amount of that going on in a band anyway, in any
Yeah.
ensemble. There's just like in a marriage.
Yeah.
So anyhow, somewhere along the line, during this odd kind of gypsy road that I traveled, I had managed to get a film degree
Okay.
from New York University. I'd gone there in the early mid-'70s, which was not too long after Martin Scorsese had been there, and his vibe was everywhere. Lots of kids were going out west to go to USC or UCLA because they wanted to emulate Zemeckis and Spielberg and the sort of California guys.
Yeah.
I was more drawn to the gritty, slightly more European style of filmmaking that Scorsese exemplified. So I decided I wanted to go to NYU, and I was there at a great time because the school was still new and the classes were small, and my classmates were people like Joel Silver, who later went on to produce the Matrix films, Amy Heckerling, who became a quite accomplished comedic director in the 90s, Martin Brest, who directed Scent of a Woman and Meet Joe Black. I mean, these were the kids I went to school with. And what happened to me there is that I went there to study screenwriting.
Okay.
But I brought my guitar with me, and every night I'd go out to the showcase clubs, the same place down in the West Village where Bob Dylan used to play back in the 60s. And they had open mic nights. And I was still hoping to get the record contract. Even though I had now gone on to do something more responsible, a little bit more responsible, I still hoped there'd be a break. So I'd go out and moonlight, playing these showcase gigs.
It's just acoustic guitar, solo
Acoustic
vocal.
guitar and me with the songs I'd written. Occasionally I'd get a second guitarist or a keyboard player or something like that, but usually it was just me. And I'd invite the students to come see me. So, oh, hey, this guy writes music. We can use him to score our film.
Yeah, yeah.
Then, as now, filmmakers really don't know the difference between a songwriter
A composer.
and a composer.
Yeah, yeah.
Music is music. But that was lucky for me because they would ask me, and, we had very limited resources to work with, far less than a place like Pulse does at this point, and then very few musicians capable of really performing an orchestral score. But we, look hither and yon and cobble together a little ensemble of musicians and bring them into the little school, the college recording studio. And at that point, I was essentially I was taking the standard 4-year program in theory and harmony, along with my film studies and so forth. So I was learning this stuff, but still consider myself a novice. Not in any way. My sight reading skills were not terrific. I had no training in orchestration whatsoever. So I was faking it, basically, which was all these guys really wanted. They wanted, a clever tune, nicely arranged, and then they were happy. They weren't looking for really serious dramatic underscoring. But the process of doing it taught me about things like synchronization. It taught me about the notion of dramatic beats and dramatic arcs within a scene, within a piece of music, and so forth. Stuff that I'd always kind of sensed was going on, even when I was a little kid and I was listening to film music, but I never studied it, much less tried to actually do it. And that was my first exposure to writing music to picture. Then I went back and spent another 6-7 years trying to develop a pop career, a career as a songwriter again, but never really forgetting what I'd learned about film. And it was in the early 80s when I finally got a job working as a production manager at Columbia College Film School in Chicago. And again, what would happen is that the students they'd be looking around for music, and they'd say, hey, this guy Andy Hill, the guy who's running, the production department, he writes music. I think he might have some experience like this.
I think Christopher Young mentioned that most of his early work as well was scoring student films. Yeah. It seems to be even around that time, and I think nowadays it is a real in. I think, you might get the next Scorsese, as a student, and you're on scoring his film. It's, to me, it seems like a legitimate way of showcasing what you can do. There's no real expectation on you, as if you were getting a massive paid gig straight away. You've got that kind of safety net, as it were, scoring. So it's just interesting that the two of you guys, Christopher and yourself, started working on student films in the beginning.
Yeah, I think it's far and away the best bet for the long game, and a better bet than building the world's greatest website, developing the world's greatest marketing campaign, grooming yourself like a top model, as some of these composers now feel compelled to do. Everybody these days feels compelled to have a brand, and that brand has to include the look of your site, the look of your logo, and even your look, and so forth. The fact is, though, that although the work with students isn't going to pay very well, if anything, in the beginning, you're absolutely right that your chances of finding the kid whose film is going to go on and make a splash at Sundance, or in Venice, or in Berlin, among the students or graduates of a prestigious film school. It can't just be any film school, but I mean, if you cultivate the kids who are at NYU or USC or UCLA, or I'm trying to think of what the equivalents in Europe would be. There are a couple of great film schools in Barcelona. There's the London Film School. There's the famous film academy in Poland, which is, the name escapes me right now. I think it starts with a G. But when young composers ask, as they always do, this question about how I get in the gate, should I try going around back and getting in the back door since everybody's hammering on the front door? There's crowds lined up. composing for media is no longer quite the rarefied specialty it used to be. There are a lot of people trying to do it, and so the competition is really stiff. And people ask about, how to present their reel, how to present, do I need a business card? Do I need a manager? Should I get a personal manager? Should I get an agent, etc.? All of this stuff is secondary to getting films. And I mean short films, long films, feature films, documentary films, experimental films, anything that will draw out from you the stuff that you feel you have to give. And if the relationship doesn't click, if you find after doing a picture or a couple of pictures with a young filmmaker that you're just not quite on the same wavelength, you can move on. But if it does click, then the chances are very good that that young filmmaker, when they do finally get into the winner's circle at one of these festivals, and that results in a little distribution deal, which then results in their film coming to the notice of bigger power brokers, whether in Hollywood or London or someplace else. So now they get their first shot at a full-fledged studio feature. Instead of having a $500,000 budget, they've got 10 or 20 or something like that, and maybe a decent cast. Who are they going to turn to? But the person who now the two of you have developed a kind of shorthand, a kind of creative shorthand. Now, it doesn't always happen. Sometimes the producers say, no, we don't want that kid you've been working with, slumming with. We want you to have a real composer. And they'll give the younger composer the boot.
But even still, if you being the composer, having worked with him, as his name goes, you still scored his film.
That's right.
To the general lay person, it mightn't be, The Last Temptation of Christ, or but you worked on one of his films anyway, so you can say that I worked with the next Scorsese. I'm not working with him anymore, but that can be your.
That's absolutely right. Just
trajectory.
Like the fellas we talked to the other day, Danny Bensi and Sander Urians, they may or may not ever do another film for Denis Villeneuve. But they did one, and it was a good one.
That was a good one, yeah.
And they're going to be able to hang that, on their wall for a long time to come. That being associated with him just at the time his star was rising. Yeah. Because he had done an early film, I mentioned the other day, called Incendies, that not a lot of people saw. It was French-Canadian, French language film.
Okay.
But it was one of these films that did festivals really well, won a couple of prestigious awards, and directed attention and heat toward him. And it was just as that heat was starting to go towards him that these two guys came on and did that Jake Gyllenhaal film for him.
Anime,
And that will mean, there's no doubt that led then to the series of films that they've worked on and are still working on.
Yeah, there's no doubt. And then that's just, you build on that, and your career goes just as fast as the directors. Maybe not as fast, but at least it gains traction and momentum, at the same time, because you both started from the same place working on those student movies, And I think even working with a student director is also beneficial because they'll be taught the industry professional, standards, like SMPTE codes and timing notes and all of the traditions and what's expected to function within, and they'll be speaking to you in those terms. They'll be dubbing to picture in the same way. Maybe not with the massive budgets and the live orchestras, but the basic underlying principles will remain the same. So if you're working with a student director who's been taught correctly, in inverted commas, there is no correctly, but the standard, then your transition into working with other directors or working with more established directors will be seamless, because you'll have that experience of
absolutely
working there.
It's remarkable how consistent the dynamic between a composer and a filmmaker, and all the variables that come into play, the spotting of the film, the need to get the director's approval, the constant revisions, the hurry up and wait situation. It's not ready. It's not ready. It's not ready. All of a sudden, go.
Yeah. Even understanding, the director's vague terminologies for what he wants. If you're dealing with a student director that's not, I'm sure that you had these experiences when you were scoring the student movies. Of someone who's describing what we would say is staccato, and he would say make it pointy, or make it like like da, and you'd be like, oh, staccato, I don't care what it is.
That doesn't change. That the basic nature of that dialogue doesn't change, whether it's Spielberg and John Williams, or you and your student filmmaker. It remains pretty much the same. Now, my story actually starts to take on a little bit more narrative interest when I left Chicago. I'd gone to school in New York, came back to Chicago, started what turned out to be my last band, and then had this experience working for Columbia College, where I was, among other things, teaching a class to young filmmakers in how to use music effectively in their films. Now, again, this was kind of another fake it till you make it sort of thing, because really, what business did I have? I was only a few years older than the kids I was teaching, and I had no real industry experience, but I had studied, and I had read every book that was then available out there about this. But every week, to prepare for my lecture, I would call people in Hollywood, cold.
All right.
There was no Google then, so it took some doing to actually get the numbers. Couldn't even do it with the Yellow Pages. You'd have to call somebody who'd call somebody else, who'd call somebody else, and finally get back to you with the number of a secretary or something like that. And you'd make these cold calls. So I would call, say, the head of music at Warner Brothers, the head of music at Universal, the head of music at Disney, and so forth, and lesser people as well. If I could come up with the name of an orchestrator, or God willing, a composer, I would call those people and I would introduce myself. And I wouldn't say, I'm an aspiring young composer, how can I get in the business? I'd use this almost the anonymity, because I didn't want to threaten them. I'd say, I'm a teacher. I'm teaching a course in music for film. Do you mind? Can you give me 5 minutes? I'd just like to shoot some questions at you about how the process actually works. How does a composer get hired these days? What kind of skill do they have? What kind of training do they have? How much do filmmakers know about music? Things like this. And little by little, I started to fill up this notebook with names and information.
I think that's called the New York hustle, isn't it?
And I also learned that there were these people out there in Hollywood they called music executives and music supervisors. Now, I knew about composers, and I knew about directors, knew about arrangers and orchestrators and conductors, but I had no idea that there were people who actually got paid to oversee or to administer the process of creating music for film. And I thought, well, I've got a college degree, and now I've had a couple of years under my belt running this little film department, so I have kind of administrative experience. Not exactly executive experience, but I can call myself that. And maybe I could get one of those gigs And at that point, I was married, had a young wife and a child, little baby. So I had to worry about how the bills were getting paid.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my ultimate goal, of course, was to compose. That's all I still wanted to do. But I thought, if I can get myself out there and get one of these more administrative gigs, then I can get onto the scoring stages and get into the studio. I can meet these people. I can find out how it's done. And as Alan Menken, who was one of my first quote-unquote clients,
All right.
as a composer, said to me, one time I said, but Alan, because Alan would always say, Andy, you are the finest music supervisor I've ever worked with. And I would say, but Alan, I'm not really a music supervisor. I'm like you. I want to be a composer. I'm a songwriter. And he would say to me, listen, my friend, whatever you're doing in the meantime is what you're doing.
It's what you're doing, yeah.
So right now, be happy that you're so good at this job. Because it's what you are, and it's how people are getting to know you around town.
Yeah.
And that was like 1987, 88, cut to 5-6 years later, that became my life. I
You're in
I was working
LA at this point?
I was in LA. I went to LA. I had to go out there cold 3 times, just driving across the country on my own, staying in cheap motels or campgrounds, whatever. I would go out to LA. I would take this little notebook that I had, with phone numbers. And to remember now, this is not that long ago, but it's long enough that people didn't even have cell phones.
Yeah.
It's me stopping by the side of the road and making a pay phone call from a booth.
You'd only see that in the movies now.
So I'd be like literally outside the Paramount Studios gate on a phone booth calling the secretary whose number I had somehow finagled out of someone to ask them if they could give me a gate pass.
Right.
Because what you want to do is get onto the lot, get past the guards at the gate. Because once you're on the lot, you start going around to these production company offices, leaving your resume, your CV, or in my case, I was leaving cassette tapes of my music. I didn't know that composers didn't get a job that way. You don't really get jobs by leaving resumes and cassettes. You get them through, personal relationships and personal contacts. But I would, it made me feel good that I was at least getting in there and talking to people, and little by little, people knew about this ambitious guy from Chicago who'd driven all the way out to LA to try and make his career in film music. And I needn't tell you a lot of the details, except that I was able to meet with every head of music for every studio in Hollywood, and some of them were legendary people like Lionel Newman and Harry Loyevsky at MGM, who are long gone now. Everywhere I went, I used the same approach, which, again, was not to say, I'm a composer and I need a gig. Will you give me one? It was, I'm out here investigating the possibility of moving my family here. I'd like to make a career somehow in the business of making music for films and television. Can I ask you a few questions? And they'd almost always be willing to give me that. Except for one guy named Brendan Cahill, who was for a brief time, was the head of music at Universal's, and he said, "Get the fuck out of my office." He was a British guy. He said, I forget, his exact words were something like, "How do I know they didn't send you here to, as a stalker for my gig?" Basically, you could be sitting in this chair tomorrow. So I'm not going to give you the time of day. Everybody else was very kind, including the head of music at Disney, who had been, prior to that, Sylvester Stallone's personal music guy, his personal music supervisor.
Right.
And he was a sweet guy, but he was a real 80s, old school gold chain and Coke spoon kind of guy. and a lot like a record guy, not
Mhm,
really a
mhm.
movie music guy. So he looked at me, and he looked at my CV, and he looked at the fact that I'd gone to film school, looked at the fact that I could write music, he looked at the fact that I taught film music,
Mhm.
and he said, you know, we don't have anybody here like you. We don't
Right.
have anybody who actually understands anything about music for the movies.
Yeah.
He said, I got publishing people, I got record people, I got technical people, but I don't have anybody like you. And I basically said, I will do all the crap that you do not want to do.
Mhm.
I'll deal with the unions. I'll deal with the recording engineers and the archiving of our masters, and I will deal with
The artists in general.
I'll deal with the artists, but I'll also deal with I won't just be a star fucker. I will work with. I'll try to build up a team
Yeah.
of arrangers and orchestrators, because Disney needed a lot of music. They needed music for the parks.
Mhm.
They needed music for all their TV spin-offs and their direct-to-DVD things and so forth.
Yeah.
So he basically said to me, kid, you got a gig. Go home. It was like just before Christmas. You go home, tell your wife Merry Christmas, you're going to Hollywood. And
Amazing.
I got home, and in those days we had answering machines, okay? So you press the beep, you have 2 new messages. And one of the messages was from this fella, and it was, Eddie, I don't know how to tell you this, but, well, I've been canned. I've been fired.
Shit.
And he said, but I like you, kid, and I'd like for you to have some success out here, so I'm going to make an introduction to the guy who's probably going to replace me. His name was Chris Montan, and you stay in touch with him and just keep, persevere, and eventually you'll get in. And he was right, and Chris Montan became the head of music at Disney, remained the head of music at Disney all the way through. He just retired 2 years ago.
Right.
And it took me a year and a half of persistence, but I finally got the gig that I had originally sort of been promised by this
Right.
guy. And I don't think I'd been there for longer than 6 months when Chris, my boss, walked in with this very nervous, kind of lost-looking guy and said, Andy, this is Alan Menken. He's here to do Little Mermaid.
What age would Alan have been at this point?
Alan was maybe 32.
Right.
So he'd never done a film before, never written a score before, other than incidental music for his Broadway stuff. And I'm still faking it,
Yeah.
by the way. But, you know this stuff, Andy, right? You know how click tracks work.
Yeah. Of
you
course.
know how Barbara, of course I do.
Yeah.
You understand SMPTE time code. You understand all
that
this stuff. There's nothing I can't learn.
Yeah.
And I made it my business to learn every
Everything.
single thing that someone like Alan would need to, so that there'd be no impediments in his way through his, rise at Disney. And it was a meteoric rise.
Yeah.
And I did 4 movies with him, and Lion King with Hans.
What were the movies you did with Alan? Little Mermaid?
Little Mermaid, Beauty and the
Beauty and the
Beast,
Beast,
Aladdin,
yeah.
and Pocahontas.
Yeah. Anastasia wasn't Alan?
Anastasia was not Alan. It was 2 other writers who were colleagues from Broadway
Right.
of Alan's, Lynn Ahrens and Stephen Flaherty.
Right.
And I got that gig. I had actually, by that time, I had left Disney
Okay.
on a calculated risk. I had I'd finished Lion King. Lion King was a huge hit.
Mm-hmm.
Lion King was the sort of movie, if you're associated with it, it builds careers.
Of course, of course.
And I thought, now's the time for me to either try and hop to another studio and get the top gig
Mm-hmm.
as head of music, or set up my own music production and supervision company.
Okay.
And because I saw there was a new wave coming, basically a lot of this work was now being farmed out and privatized
Mm-hmm.
because the studios could no longer afford to keep all this staff
Yeah.
on salary.
Well, this would have been around the millennium.
This was
2000?
just before that.
Just before.
Yeah, it was like 1997, 98.
Okay, yeah.
And I started a company. I found a place. I based it out of a post-production building in Hollywood. And that's when I got the Anastasia gig came as a result of having
Okay.
done the Disney stuff, because Fox wanted to duplicate the Disney formula.
Right.
And so naturally they wanted to hire the guy who'd been involved
Yeah.
with that.
Mm-hmm.
Then I did James and the Giant Peach with
Yeah.
Randy Newman. That was for Disney,
Mm-hmm.
but it was a
But
it
you
was
were a
job I
third
got
party,
as a
yeah.
freelancer. Yeah, as
Yeah,
a
yeah.
third party. And I did a string of smaller projects for
Mhm.
Disney over the next few years. The great dream that I had of parlaying the success at Disney into, you know, like a Clive Davis kind of career was, you get used to in life to detours, and there were a number of them that came up right around the millennium. The biggest one of which was the effective end of the record business
Yeah.
as
yeah.
we know it, and Napster and all of that.
Napster, yeah.
The
yeah,
reason
yeah.
this affected me is because as a freelance, as a third-party music supervisor, my salary, my fee was generally paid by an advance from the record company.
Mm-hmm.
So the film's producer or the music executive would approach the record company, make a soundtrack deal. Sometimes it was an in-house deal, like if the movie was being done for Warner's, it might be one of the Warner Brothers labels that was going to do the soundtrack. So you'd approach them and you'd say, okay, give us $100,000 or $250,000 or $500,000 or whatever, depending on the size of the project and the talent involved. And that advance would, to some degree, subsidize
Yeah.
the production of the music
Mm-hmm.
for the film, including the fee paid to the music supervisor.
But that would be considered a package deal now,
It was,
would
a,
it? Yeah.
it was a package
Yeah,
deal,
yeah.
essentially, and then you could go out, you could hire a composer, or at least augment you could help underwrite the costs of producing the music with this advance.
Yeah.
When the record business started to diminish and soundtrack albums were no longer a hot thing, and that starts to happen right around 1999,
Yeah.
all that money goes away. Now all of a sudden music supervisors had to find somewhere to squeeze their fees out of the film budget,
Right.
totally aside from any record advance money. And films, notoriously, still today, and especially indie films, you know, at that time, 1999, 2000, this would have been films produced for the vicinity of $5 million, maybe up to 10 or 12, but sometimes less than that. Films in that range budgeted nothing for music.
Yeah.
What they would put in there is some music for some money for music rights. Because okay, we want to use this U2 song, we want to use this Madonna song, or we want to use this New Order song, and we know that's going to cost us a certain amount of money to clear and license and get into the film. That's where most of their money went. Whatever was left, the pittance that was left, they would use to hire a music supervisor, hoping that the music supervisor could broker in everything else, basically get them cheap songs, you know, on sweetheart deals that he had with publishers or record companies, and get them some young composer
Yeah.
who was willing to work relatively cheap for a package deal. And, either do the whole thing electronically or go over to Prague or what have you.
Yeah, Sofia in Bulgaria or something like that, yeah.
But by the time we got to around 2002, 2003, I was competing with people who didn't have families, who didn't have children, for gigs that paid, $5,000-$10,000 for the entire thing for like 6 months of work that only a couple years before had paid 60, 75 more. And it wasn't, it simply wasn't a viable thing to do anymore. So I made some efforts to get back into the studio side of things, but all the positions were full. And when those positions are full, it's like being director of the FBI or like having a seat on the stock exchange. You don't give it up unless you get fired.
Wow.
And that's when I decided to teach.
Right. Okay.
And what I brought to the teaching is the fact that for a 10-year run, I'd been on the scoring stage as the right hand, essentially the sort of like a line producer for, a lot of these guys are gone now. Maurice Jarre, Jerry Goldsmith, John Barry, Howard Shore, he's not gone,
Zimmer.
Elmer Bernstein, Hans Zimmer, Mark Isham, Danny Elfman, James Newton Howard, Basil Polidorus, just about everybody but John Williams, because Disney could never afford John Williams.
I wonder what a Disney movie scored by John Williams would sound like. Ravel, I think.
Yeah, maybe.
I think it would be another Ravel's type score.
Yeah. But go ahead.
So, can we circle back, because I want to touch on the Lion King, and you spoke about it before, but you didn't know that it was going to be a hit when you started on the project. Can you talk us through from you saying, or your boss saying, that this is a back burner project until the epiphany when you said this is gonna be big? You said it was your daughter?
Yeah, Disney in those days had decided to release one animated musical per year.
Right.
It actually had begun a year before Little Mermaid with a movie called Oliver and Company that was scored by a series of different, Billy Joel, Huey Lewis, the Pointer Sisters were in there. That was followed up by Little Mermaid. And with Little Mermaid, they embraced essentially a Broadway or West End musical theater model of producing animated musicals. So they brought in songwriting team, principally Menken and Ashman from Broadway. They would develop the material same time as the script was being developed, etc. So they'd done one a year, and with great success. Little Mermaid, Oscars.
Aladdin,
Beauty and the Beast, Oscars. Even a nomination for Best Picture.
Yeah.
Aladdin, Oscars for score and song.
The Beauty and the Beast is live. They're doing all these films that you oversaw in the 90s are coming back now in live action, aren't they?
They're coming back. First they go, Disney, knows how to milk the franchise. They put it out there as a live show, first of all.
Right.
Then they adapt the live show into a live action film.
Yeah. And then they do it on ice.
That's right. So they've got multiple incarnations of the same thing. But at any rate, for some reason, there was a gap year between 93 and 95. And Pocahontas was due in 95, and they were banking on that one. Howard Ashman, Alan Menken's lyricist, had died, but he was now working with a guy named Stephen Schwartz, who had done Pippin.
He does Wicked
and all of that.
But he hadn't done Wicked. He will go on to do Wicked.
That's right. But they had big hopes for Pocahontas. And in the meantime, all they had to plug the gap with was this little movie they were calling King of the Jungle, which, as I explained to you guys, it read like almost more like a television cartoon. The characters were kind of goofy. I mean, Timon and
Timon and
Pumbaa. Sorry,
Timon and Pumbaa. It's my childhood. It'll never leave me.
They were still there, but the whole thing kind of felt like that. It felt cartoony. Whereas what they tried to do with Beauty and the Beast, and now we're going to do with Pocahontas, is bring this degree of reality, of dramatic reality to these movies. So anyhow, long story short, they didn't have a composer lined up because Alan was committed to Pocahontas, and they had a batch of songs they'd commissioned from Elton John, which were clever and hooky, like all of his stuff, but had very little to do with the setting of the story.
The goofiness of it,
Yeah, it was... Let's put it this way. It was... If they had left the film as it was, it would have felt a bit like doing a kind of vaudeville shtick about the animals of Africa, and the king of the jungle and his hilarious sidekicks, and his wicked Uncle Scar and so forth. But it would have been, I think, very much, probably very much enjoyable to the key target audience of kids between 4 and 9 or whatever, but it would never have been a really sizable hit. And what happened, as I explained, is that I was assigned to work with the arrangers who were tasked with taking the Elton John songs and essentially setting them up within the script as vehicles that could convey story. So you have character enters, character begins singing, character B joins in, character C joins in on the chorus, and etc.
And was what was his name, the voice of Simba?
Matthew Broderick.
Was Matthew Broderick was he attached to the project at that point?
He probably was attached, but I think at this point they were probably using all voice actors who might be told, okay, eventually Jeremy Irons is going to do this role, Matthew Broderick's going to do this, so we need that kind of vibe. But we were demoing all these songs with stand-ins, essentially, and they weren't coming out too impressively. There's nothing wrong with the songs per se, and there was nothing wrong with the arrangers per se. It was that after Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin, it was just kind of a letdown, because those songs were so theatrical.
Big songs.
They felt so much like they belonged on the big screen and so forth. So anyhow, this is when a couple of us began brainstorming. Is there another way we can go? We're not going to get Elton back in to write new songs, and we didn't. And Elton had no experience with musical theater either, so he didn't know people who could really help us, and we couldn't go to Alan and his people. They were already busy, and we had just done a film with Hans Zimmer, an adaptation of the Jack London story White Fang. Takes place in the Yukon, in the Northwest Territory, and it's an action adventure basically written for young boys, about life, in the Great North, and it involved the main character is a dog, and so this was one of Disney's staple kind of films. They put out, in those days, they put out 3 or 4 of these a year. Usually had something to do with an animal. And Hans was, this kind of edgy electronic neo-evangelist kind of guy.
Yeah.
But he really wanted to do a Disney film. And so we gave him a shot on White Fang. Through a series of circumstances, another film was tossed out, and Hans was there, right time, right place, and was the only guy who could actually do the gig over Christmas. So I went over to London with him, and he while he literally wrote and recorded this White Fang score in a period of about 10 days.
Jeez. It's like, was it the Jerry Goldsmith story of him scoring, was it Basic Instinct in 3 weeks or something?
Yeah, that's about right.
And every time he told the story, it decreased by 2 days.
Yeah.
And I was like, I had 3 weeks to get that done. I had 2.5 weeks to get that done.
Well, this was the space between Christmas and New Year's, essentially.
That's impressive.
That he had to write in. And he was working with a team of writers, a guy named Fiachra Trench, who's from Ireland.
Yeah, Fiachra.
Nick Lenny Smith was working with him, and Shirley Walker was working with him. So Hans would be at the keyboard cranking out themes for each of the characters, leitmotifs, and so forth, and then his composer orchestrators would take those and run with them, and go and arrange them for the film. At any rate, to cut to the chase, the score got back to L.A., and in the end, for reasons that were political and not musical, it was not used in White Fang. But what it did is it convinced everybody that Hans could do animals.
Yeah.
He could do
big songs,
heart-swelling emotion. He could do melody.
Yeah.
All these things that he had, in a way, maybe he was like the smartest guy in the world, because I think he wanted Lion King.
Yeah.
And in a sense, this was his audition for it. It had electronic elements, which were part of his patented sound, but it was mostly an orchestral score. It had warmth. It had choral passages and so forth. So it made it a whole lot easier then for me and my boss and the people who believed in him to go to the powers that be at Disney and say, he can do it.
This is the guy, yeah.
And I truly think that the hiring of Hans Zimmer, which coincided with a few other things, changes on the film. It coincided with Jeremy Irons coming on board as Scar. It coincided with an edict from the head of the studio, from Jeffrey Katzenberg, that all the cartoony stuff had to go.
Right.
That he wanted the movie to
become more serious.
To be in keeping with the new style that they developed, on films like Beauty and the Beast. And that forced the filmmakers and the writers to reach higher and to begin to think, okay, what really is this story? What are its analogs? The son of the deposed, assassinated king is sent into exile, where he has to rediscover, his destiny and return to claim the throne and his rightful place. Well, all of a sudden, it started to feel kind of Shakespearean.
Yeah.
It started to feel mythical.
Yeah.
And that, in turn, pumped up the people working around Hans to make these arrangements more and more
epic
in scope and ambition. And that finally, and then, Hans kept saying to me, to put the icing on this cake, we really need to go to Africa.
Yeah.
And I would go back to my boss and say, to put the icing on this cake, we really need to go to Africa. And he would say, in your dreams.
Yeah.
Disney will never pay for that. Something you can do, because he wanted the vocal sound that's associated with South Africa.
He tours with them now, doesn't he? The guy that did the introduction.
Lebo Morake, Lebo M, yes.
Yeah.
And
it's amazing that they're still together. Nearly over 20 years later.
Absolutely. And but the nail in the coffin seemed to be the fact that South Africa at that point was in chaos.
Yeah.
There was white flight.
Yeah.
Mandela had won the election. The Truth and Reconciliation committees, that so forth, that were going to deal with the injustices of apartheid were now in force. So there was a lot of worry that there might actually be civil war.
Was the embargo still there?
I don't know about that. I know that there was a real worry that there was going to be civil war.
Yeah, because Paul Simon did.
Yeah.
He went like a few years before, and they told him not
Right,
to.
right. So at that point, my boss and the producer of the film came to me and said, "You're going to have to tell Hans to forget about this, because even if we had the money to send you guys down there, even if we had the time to send you guys down there, the insurance risk for the studio, if your little chartered plane gets shot down in the middle of a South African civil war, or if the tapes." And these days we were still dealing with big boxes of 1 inch or 2 inch open reel tape. You guys could be hostages. The project could be held hostage, etc. No, you're not going. And I know we have to wrap up here, but I will just tell you that I made the most passionate plea I've ever made for any artistic cause in my life, including my own, that they allow us to do this. And it was essentially by, playing them recordings of what these ensembles sounded like down there, and, doing mashups and so forth with the Lion King stuff. Everybody kind of got a sense of what it might be. And I don't remember exactly what the breakthrough was, Connor, when they finally said, "Yeah, you can do it."
But you got it. You got to push through, and it went through.
I got to push through, and they put me on the plane with Lebo M, with the guy whose voice opens Lion King.
Fantastic
with
voice.
Jay Rifkin, who was at that time Hans's chief engineer, and Nick Lenny Smith, who was at that time Hans's senior orchestrator. So the four of us flew to Johannesburg and then took a private plane to Umbato, where there was this amazing studio called BOP. I have no idea if it's still there. Extravagantly outfitted studio that nobody used because it was out in the middle of the South African veldt.
Right.
It was a tax write-off for somebody, I suppose, but it was gorgeous. And we bussed in kids from Durban and Johannesburg.
Soweto.
Who had been, we had them working to tapes prepared for them by Hans and Lebo. And and I hired a guy named Mbongeni Ngema, who had a successful musical called Sarafina, that used some of this South African township style music. And so he was down there coaching these kids weeks ahead of our arrival, so that by the time they finally got bussed into the studio, they were sort of ready to go.
They're ready to go, yeah. And the rest is history then.
Yeah.
Just
rest is history, and then anyhow, to wrap it up, I left Hollywood in 2006. I'd been teaching summer workshops for film composers coming out from Chicago for the past 3 years, and they've been very successful. And the same school, Columbia College, called me and said, "We want to start a master's program.
right.
Would you run it for us?" And I had, up until that point, I would have said no. But at this stage, I said, "This sounds like a good idea."
Yeah, sounds a good idea.
And that led to 6 years in Chicago, which led to 3 years overseas with Berkeley, and then in Belgium. And that's how I met Derek.
Derek here.
Yeah.
And you have just finally, you have your new book. Is it out or is it coming out?
The book,
it's out in
here's
digital.
what I did. I wanted to write something that I knew would be a hard sell because it's a niche market.
It is.
Although it's a growing market.
Was it like the 21st century on the track?
And that's what, from your lips to God's ear, that's what some people are calling it.
I would agree.
On the Track was really the only.
Yeah.
In terms of sort of technique.
Yeah.
How to.
Yeah.
You know, how is it done?
With real life examples as well.
All the other books dealing with film music, including some of those written by composers and people who do know the craft, have essentially been, 200-300 page of verbiage, of words.
Yeah.
Talking about the business, talking about the realities of working in the entertainment business, budgets, legal issues, contract negotiation, things like that, but generally not dealing much with the music. And one of the reasons for that is that it's expensive and difficult to get that music licensed so that people can actually look at it and see what the composers did.
Yeah.
The only guy who had done that prior to me was Fred Karlow with On the Track.
On the Track, yeah.
It's a big book. It is a great book, and it was very much my model for this. So when I decided I wanted to do this, Colin, I said, it's going to be expensive. It's going to be time consuming. I'm never going to get a book advance to help defray my expenses or cover the time I have to spend writing this. And I just heard not too long before that about this whole Kickstarter thing.
Right. You did a Kickstarter?
And I decided, what the hell?
Yeah.
And I said, I won't do it like people are trying to do Kickstarter to raise money to make a movie or something like that.
They do them for everything.
They go to everybody, brothers and cousins and anybody. I said, I'm going to try a different tack. I said, the people who will benefit the most from the publication of a book like this are the people in the craft themselves, because it brings attention to their work. It makes their work look noble and exciting and worthy of scholarship and so forth.
Yeah.
And guess what? Those people also can afford, to help me bankroll a Kickstarter campaign.
Yeah.
So that's what I did. I essentially directed the campaign to people in the industry, and they were very generous. I didn't ask for a lot of money. I just needed enough money to buy myself like 3 or 4 months uninterrupted to get the thing off the ground and determine how much it was going to cost to license this music. And but I got help from John Powell. I got help from Don Davis. I got help from James Newton Howard. I got help from all sorts of wonderful people who kicked in and gave me the head start I needed.
Yeah.
In January of last year, of 2016, I put the book up online for sale as a download. It's the complete book, but it's self-edited. It has not had the services of a professional copy editor to go in and weed out every little typographical error. It has not had the services of professional score editor to go in and weed out every possible notational error. Although I've sent every bar of music that's in the book to the composers. To proof themselves. So I feel pretty confident about what's.
Yeah, I've read it, and there's nothing that has jumped out at me. Going, but I wasn't looking for errors at the same time. I was just trying to digest information, which is, I must say, it's incredibly easily digestible. The way it reads is, it's so clean and clear. You've got a little bit of text that's talking about the context, the situation, the deaths, the scene where Bruce Willis realizes he's dead, and here's the music that makes that scene from James Newton Howard, that makes it seem, so good, that gives it that third dimension. And here's a reduction of that sad music. You can see how he's moving harmonically, you can see how he's moving melodically, thematically. And I read it over Christmas, and it was the perfect segue for your lectures. I think it should be a required reading for anyone who's taking your classes. I'm
really happy to hear.
Whereas On the Track it's a big endeavor. It's a huge. It's a dip in and out book. It's like reading Adler or something like that. It's really dense.
It is dense, and it's also kind of equally directed to people like music editors and orchestrators and the ancillary crafts. This is just about the music.
Yes,
and I'm really glad to hear that it's clear, because writing about music and finding words that sing, that speak in the way that music does is tricky. And I'm hoping that what composers can use this for is to kind of, it's like reverse engineering. It's reverse scoring. Now the work is done. Composers delivered the score, and it's on the screen. And we know it's effective, and we know it works. When we think about a film like The Matrix, or Perfume, The Story of a Murderer, or Danny Elfman's Alice in Wonderland, we already know that it works. We want to understand how and why. And the idea of the book is that you sit down either with the book on the screen or opened in front of you as a text. And it'll be available as a text this year through Hal Leonard.
Do you know what month that'll be available in?
Well, it was originally supposed to be April, and because of the editorial, because of all the clearance that's required, they've pushed the actual street date to June 1st. They're going to start taking pre-orders in April, is what they've told me.
Right.
But anyhow, you open the book in front of you, you have the film on the screen, you have your keyboard, your MIDI keyboard in front of you, and basically you can use these reductions to recreate and to understand how the composer approached each dramatic challenge they had to face in the course of doing that film, how they answered objections that the director had, how they solved the kinds of problems. Are the scenes not scary enough? The scenes not funny enough? The scenes not romantic enough? And because the book was written in collaboration with the composers, with them being interviewed, and I'd shoot an email off and say, I'm looking at this cue right now, and I just don't, there are two bars here I just don't understand. How in the world did you come up with this?
I think one of the things is understanding and trying to digest standard repertoire is much easier in many respects, because it follows on. You've got your start, your middle, and end, and it's clear, and here's the development of the theme. Here's theme 2 presented, and it's dominant, and blah 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 blah. Whereas film music, it's so volatile. It just changes. I've written a piece here. I've just submitted it, and the first half is classic orchestral, then the second half is orchestral with synths. And it's like, how has it changed? Like, so if you're talking to James Newton, it's like, I can't explain these two bars here. Like, what have you done? And he's no reason to, because it doesn't relate to. It doesn't have to relate. It can do what it wants.
Right.
So what was his reply to you when you said to him that he didn't understand these two bars?
Well, what these guys, and it wasn't James in particular. It wasn't James. Most of my questions, a lot of them were for Don Davis, because the
Matrix stuff.
Yeah, in The Matrix there are musical effects. Like he had to find. They use this thing called bullet time, which is the slow motion used in the Matrix that makes it look like the main character, the lead character, is in slow-mo and the world around them is moving at a normal tempo.
Yeah.
Okay? So it's a push-pull kind of effect. And Don had to find musical statements and gestures that are the counterpart of that. So I had a lot of questions about that, about whether my accent, dynamic, and articulation marks were correct in really expressing what he wanted to do. A lot of my questions for composers were about articulations and so forth, because when you're working from a concert score, you see how sloppy some of these scores are, basically. And some,
So you recreated them all yourself?
I had to recreate them all, basically. So
amazing.
And with Morricone's Untouchable score had hardly any dynamic markings or accents or anything in it, because he dictates all that stuff from the stand, from the podium.
Amazing.
So there were a lot of questions about that sort of thing, mostly detail questions, technical questions.
And it was an enjoyable process, you think?
It was arduous, but it was.
Did you find yourself learning things that you didn't know?
Hell yes. It was like, I look at it as akin to maybe if you're one of these people like Indiana Jones who's absolutely fascinated by like how the pyramids were constructed or something, you just can't wait to get down there in those chambers and find out what their purpose was. That's what it was like for me. I love this stuff. Film music moves me. It always has. Music in general moves me, but there's something about the synthesis of picture and music. There's something that occurs that is greater than the sum of the parts.
It's the Wagner's total work, isn't it?
That's right. I think cinema is the realization of that.
I would agree.
I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the German word, but I know exactly what you mean.
I know the total Kunstwerk or something.
Total music. Something.
Gesamte Kunstwerk. I'm not even going to try and butcher the German language on the internet. But I've always said if Wagner was alive in the 21st century, the water tank with the WB would just be a W.
Right. I think you're probably right. I think there are a number of people who would have made their trade as film composers had they been around now. But I find the work fascinating. It was particularly the degree of accuracy that had to be brought to these reductions was, caused me not only a lot of long nights, but a lot of, aching joints and fingers and neck muscles and back and so forth, because it's you've copied your own work before. You know how arduous
and you did MIDI reductions and MIDI mock-ups of it all as well, to hear that it sounded right.
I did MIDI. If I needed to get a broad understanding of the composer's approach, I would do a MIDI mock-up beforehand. In most cases, where I was already familiar with the composer's work, the score was enough, and what I would do is I would do the reduction. I would decide, first of all, going through the bar, which parts I would cull for the reduction, eliminating doublings and incidental parts and things like that weren't central to the idea of the cue. Then I would decide, how much of it I would reduce. Sometimes couldn't do the entire cue. Never could do the entire score. And finding ways to build the reductions so that they would really show students how this particular composer worked as opposed to another composer and so forth. Do all that and then work direct into finale and keep playing back the crappy sounding, finale MIDI, until I was convinced that the things like syncopation and so forth were properly notated. What time do you have?
It's so difficult. We're on just 6 o'clock.
Okay.
So just to wrap up now, the last question I wanted to ask you, I was kind of wanted to have a reoccurring theme for anyone that comes on, would be if you could choose one director, one composer to work with now, one film. If you could have one director, one composer, and one film off the top of your head, what would you have?
As a music producer, as a music supervisor?
And as a fan.
Yeah. I would love. I've never done a movie with Elliot Goldenthal. I've worked with almost everybody else, and there are some very exciting up and comers. But for sort of like a total immersion musical experience, I would love to work with him. I would love to see him working with someone the level when he did his work with Neil Jordan. It was the best work that Elliot's done, but Neil isn't as active anymore as he was before. So it would have to be somebody on the level of like a Paul Thomas Anderson, the guy who did There Will Be Blood, and The Master, and something that ambitious, that big in theme. I like Chris Nolan. I like David Fincher. I'm very drawn to all of these guys, but I think I'm most drawn to people who tackle the sort of big subjects and the big concepts, and that's something that Elliot would be perfect for. And I think what I wish they would do. In fact, those guys would be perfect for it. I wrote a screenplay a couple years back based on the life and works of a character I hugely admire, Nikola Tesla. Which Hollywood's been talking about a Tesla film since the 70s and still hasn't come through with one other than that cameo from David Bowie in The Prestige.
They might get there. They've done Stephen Hawking. They've done Alan Turing. So they need a John von Neumann and a Tesla, Nikola Tesla.
But Paul Thomas Anderson or someone like David Fincher directing, I don't know, Johnny Depp or someone that level as Tesla.
With, I can see it.
With music by Elliot Goldenthal would be a great.
That's a hit. That's a hit. Make it happen.
Yeah.
Okay, Andrew. Thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time. Is there anywhere that people can find you online? Is there a Twitter account or?
There's first of all the website that is designed to allow downloads of the book is not just for downloads of the book. It also has there's a blog there.
Yeah. I'll embed the link. I'll embed the link where this podcast will be.
That's right, and there's also an opportunity for feedback and dialogue with me via the website, and it's just scoringthescreen.com.
All one word.
All one word. All
Scoring
lowercase.
the Screen.
Scoringthescreen.com.
Okay.
And you can go directly to the contact page if you want to leave me a note.
Great.
There's a linked Facebook page also called Scoring the Screen that is an open forum page, so anybody who wants to can post to the page. I try to keep both of these relatively up to date. When I hear about something exciting or someone out there who's doing something interesting, when I do an interview, or I get news about the book or something like that, I'll post it. I'm not as diligent as I should be, but
we can't be everywhere at once. But I highly recommend for everyone that's checked this podcast out to go and look at that book. I think it'll be in every film scoring class in the next 10 years. That's my prediction. I think that's where you'll strike oil there
I hope
in the
you've
education business.
I believe in your crystal ball.
My Delphi powers. Okay, Andrew, thanks so much for coming on.
It's been a pleasure, and anytime, man.
Yeah, we'll speak soon.
Looking forward to being back in Dublin.